Hey guys, so we are going to start units 5 and 6 today, but I wanted to just give a short explanation on why units 5 and 6 are combined together and not two separate units. One is because both of them are pretty short. Each one only has 5 objectives, so having them stand alone seems kind of silly, but there's a historical reason they're combined too, and that is because units 5 and 6 happen at the same time. So when we've been going through the course as it is, unit 1, 2, 3, 4, so on, these have all happened kind of chronologically, right? We haven't really been like, oh, and at the same time, this is also happening. We're now going to get into a period of time. It's called the antebellum era. It's just the time before the Civil War, where we're going to be talking about lots of different things that are all happening simultaneously. So we're going to start by talking about Unit 5. This is called antebellum reform, which is basically how America is changing, developing its own unique American identity, but also like recognizing some of the flaws in the American fabric and trying to fix some of those things, like ending slavery or increase rights for women, or better prison systems, stuff like that. That we'll be looking at in Unit 5. And then with Unit 6, we're going to be looking at while all this stuff is happening with reform, we also see that the country is starting to split apart, especially when it comes to expansion westward and adding new lands and how that is going to affect the slavery debate, which eventually is going to lead us into Unit 7, which will be our Civil War unit. And then we'll kind of continue on chronologically after that. So we're going to do our first objective in Unit 5 today, and it's called the Developing American Identity. We're basically going to be looking at what is making America unique compared to all other countries, especially European countries, in the 1800s. So we'll be describing, elements of the American identity or the American personality in the 1800s. So in the early 1800s, we do see a rise in nationalism, which isn't exactly the same thing as patriotism, but it is, pride in your country, unity among your country, that kind of thing. We see that because of obviously the independence that we got from Great Britain. But then that later is followed by the era of good feelings eventually, right, where we have this rise in nationalism, the American system, the increase in industrialization in the country. Also, the relationship that we have with Native Americans, like European countries don't really have that. We're just starting to kind of see that America is becoming different. It's not just an extension of Great Britain. Like it is a unique country that has its own personality. And some of the ways that we see that happen are in Romanticism. So this is going to kind of cross some paths with your English class and what you're learning in English 3 when we talk about Romanticism and Transcendentalism and stuff like that. You guys are learning about the literary parts of those movements in English. We are going to look at the historical parts of those movements in this class. So Romanticism, it was a 19th century or 1800s artistic and literary movement that happened not only in America but also in Europe. But we're going to focus on what it looks like in America and how that's distinctly American. Romanticism typically emphasizes emotion and emotional experiences and also individualism and how people specifically are connecting with nature. So it heavily glorified nature, made it seem like it was something that is very powerful, but also very inviting at the same time. And so one of the ways that we see Romanticism in the American identity is through an artistic movement known as the Hudson River School. So here, when I say school, it's not like a college that you go to or like classes you take. School is another way to say like your way of thinking or like your perspective. So this is just like a way to paint. It is mostly going to be pictures of the frontier or like the American West. So it's really big pictures of like the sky and mountains and weather and what's the word I'm looking for? Like geographic elements that are out west. Like this is Niagara Falls over here in this image. And it really emphasizes how beautiful America is and how bountiful or like how much it has to offer. And when people who are all crowded on the East Coast, they look at these pictures and they're like, wow, that's out west. That's amazing. Look at all that land. Look at that space. Like I could definitely live there. It really encourages people to move out west. Now, the founder of this artistic movement, or the Hudson River School, was a guy named Thomas Cole. He's just the most famous painter who did these types of paintings. This also was something that Europeans saw over in Europe, and because they don't really have spaces like this. I mean, Europe is at that point it was like pretty industrialized, lots of big cities. It's very different in America where we have all this land that is really untouched by industrialization and things like that. And so even Europeans would look at these paintings and be like, dang, America looks awesome. I want to move there too. Another thing that we see that's distinctly American in this time is a American book. It's called The Last of the Mohicans. The Mohicans is a Native American tribe. And it's the first great American novel written by an American for Americans about an American story. Because up until this point, most Americans are just reading like British novels about like British stories or European stories. So here we're going to have an American book. The author is James Fenimore Cooper. The storyline is basically telling about the French and Indian War, about a character. I think his name is Hawkeye, I'm pretty sure is the main character's name. You can go watch the movie if you want. Daniel Day-Lewis starred in it. There's the link to the trailer if you want to go watch that in the PowerPoint notes. But basically, it's this guy's journey through the French and Indian War. There's some love story parts in it. It has a lot to do with Native Americans as well. It kind of demonizes a lot of Native Americans too. It makes them look really dangerous and really savage. And so when people are reading this book, they kind of get this idea that any Native Americans that are out in the West, even though this book was about the French and Indian War, that was like over 100 years earlier, Americans kind of get this idea that like Native Americans are still savage. They're still murderers. They're still uncivilized. So it's okay for us to take land away from them and even kill them in the process. And Europeans also kind of got that view too if they read this book. Like America is filled of, with all these wild Native Americans that are living in the West. And if we move out there, then it's, okay to treat them as subhumans as well. Okay, so lastly, I know I've been talking a lot about how Europeans view the US. There was actually a guy who wrote a book about this at the time. His name was Alexis de Tocqueville. I'm sure there's a beautiful French way to say that. But he was a French historian and a writer, and he visited America in the 1830s and traveled around the East Coast mostly. I think he may have went west a little bit, but he basically was just like studying America. What makes America different than not only France, but also just European countries at the time. So he took all of his observations and he put it into a book in 1835 called Democracy in America, where he basically just described what America was like. He talked a lot about the government system because remember, America is the only country at this time doing like a democracy thing, or at least having it kind of work out pretty well. Where he's from France and they're still reeling from the effects of the French Revolution still at that point. And so he talks a lot about the government and how that works. He talks a lot about how Americans really value freedom and individualism, how Americans say they value equality, but however, like they really don't. He called out that contradiction for sure. He was saying like, women don't have rights, slavery still exists. So, that's definitely contradictory. He also talked a lot about religion and how America was really founded in these religious undertones and how America's like focus on Christianity made it morally good. And that was a guiding light for the people in America. And he also talked about how much land was available and how that was so different than European countries as well. So these are kind of the things that, not all of them, but some things that made America different from other countries in the world in the early 1800s.